I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
We can talk about language as if it's this esoteric thing, but this was a group of people who were seriously reckoning with the accountability that comes with the language that you use.
That's poet and peacemaker Pádraig Ó Tuama discussing his work as the artist in residence at Corrymeela, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community.
The idea really was to say, this is what you said, and then to see what happens when people hear what it is that they've said.
We'll hear Pádraig's commentary on the power of language, the hard work of reconciliation, and poetry as a practice of living well.
Legitimate target has 16 letters and one long, abominable space between two dehumanizing words.
All coming right up.
Poetry has the power to connect our inner universe and the outer world. I'm Maggie Smith, poet and host of The Slowdown, a podcast from American Public Media. Each weekday, find time to take a breather from your to-do list, or doom scrolling for that matter, and take in a moment of reflection with a hand-picked poem. Listen to The Slowdown wherever you get podcasts.
Hey, it's Jacob Lewis, executive producer of No Small Endeavor. My icon? Lee C. Camp. I get to see his days up close and personal. Studio in the morning, writing over lunch, live event before the ink dries. If I lived in his shoes for a day, I'd be begging for a nap. Our icons run hot, so the fuel's got to keep up. That's why I reach for cassava. Like the icons we love, I need nourishment that moves with me wherever the day goes. First off, cassava is delicious. More milkshake than chalky health drink. I'm a chocolate guy. 2 scoops, cold water, oat milk, couple ice cubes. Sometimes I even put a splash of iced coffee, and I'm out the door. 30 seconds, and I feel clear, focused, and full for hours. It's got all the good stuff your mind and body crave for whole body health. With every 2 scoops, you get 85 plus superfoods, nutrients, and plant-based ingredients. You can try cassava risk-free with their Love It guarantee. Thousands of rave reviews agree you're going to love it. So, make your day iconic with cassava. Go to cassava.com and use code NSE for 15% off your next order. That's cassava, KACHAVA.com, code NSE for 15% off.
Over the last 20 years, L'Oréal Paris has honored 200 women of worth, uplifting their communities. Women who see the worth in every person, overlooked or underserved, who see an opportunity for change, who see a chance for better. They may be one of 200, but their journeys are always uniquely one of one. Here's to 200 more women of worth.
We're worth it.
We're worth it.
We're worth it.
We're worth it.
I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. This is part 3 of our series entitled, What is Poetry's Role When the World is Burning? We take that question from poet Christian Wiman, which he raises in his memoir, My Bright Abyss. In the midst of war, climate devastation, and our own clinging to privilege, what is the role of poetry when the world is burning? We're in the midst of exploring that question with 3 celebrated poets. In part 1, we spoke with 3-term U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. In part 2, we spoke with Haile Eliza Ghafouri, translator of the 13th century Sufi mystic and poet Rumi. And today, we're delighted to share with you our conversation with poet, theologian, and peacemaker Pádraig Ó Tuama. Pádraig has served as the leader of Corrymeela, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community, from 2014 to 2019. He's also the host of On Being's Poetry Unbound. He's published numerous volumes of poetry, essays, a memoir, and theology, and he currently resides in New York City, where he is a visiting scholar at the Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution at Columbia University. We're pleased to welcome Pádraig back to No Small Endeavor for a second time. Enjoy. Welcome back, Pádraig.
Thanks very much, Lee. Nice to be with you.
It's good to be with you again. I remember our first conversation with a lot of fondness and gratefully get to spend some time with you again today. What's top of mind for you that you would want to most clearly say? What is poetry's role when the world is burning?
I always stumble over the word role when it comes to art. I think poetry and art is an event. Like, it isn't a project, it isn't a strategic plan. You don't do it so that you get something else. And I don't think you can predict what a role is. I think poetry's demand can be spoken about. Poetry's event or phenomenon can be spoken about. And in that situation, what we can say is that art is made by people from all cultures and in all kinds of circumstances. And sometimes it is part of the resistance, and sometimes it's part of the grief, and sometimes it's part of the survival, and sometimes it's written by people who are part of the problem. There's no morality in a certain sense to art because it has occurred everywhere. So we can say that it is a phenomenon that's at the center of the human project, for good or ill. And I suppose, like all things, we hope it can be used for good.
I'm fascinated with what you said there about there is no morality as such in art. Unpack that for us a little bit more.
Well, it's a nice idea to think that lofty words are accompanied by lofty action, but that's not the case. Edmund Spenser, the writer of The Fairy Queen, also wrote pretty terrible rhetoric on behalf of the British government about their so-called colonies, Ireland being one of them. That's just one example. We could go through many where people who are profoundly skilled and profoundly committed to their art form and write some very beautiful things perhaps about nature, they were not given to thinking about people when it came to some of their work, and they wrote about women or people from other countries or people from colonies that their country might have made without the kind of intellectual rigor that they might have given sometimes to a flower or to a bird. And we've all got ways in which we've got limitations, but it is too easy to think that lofty words lead to lofty action. They don't always. We also know that liquid words can sometimes make people feel in a certain way where it can be difficult to challenge. And in that way, perhaps the loftier your language is, the more careful people need to be when they listen to you, because you could be easily fooled.
You began to be captivated by poetry from a very young age. I think I read you were like memorizing like 70 poems a year or something as a 9-year-old. Is that?
Yeah, well, not just me. It was the education system. Poetry is so important in Irish culture. So we were learning poems off by heart, one in Irish, Gaelic, you might say, and one in English every week between the ages of 5 to 17. So that was about 70 poems a year, half in English, half in Irish.
I mean, that's incredible. When you look back on that experience, and I'm trying to avoid instrumentalizing language because you pointed us to be careful of that in your opening comment, but how would you say that that formed you? What did that do to you? How did that dispose you towards the world, do you think?
Well, lots of the poems we learned in Irish were poems about the struggle against British presence in Ireland. And so I suppose one of the things that pointed to was that art has always concerned itself with contemporary life. And so I hear sometimes people saying, oh, it's kind of annoying the way poetry has turned political lately. And I think, well, poetry's always been political, and I mean, the Irish tradition is not an old tradition regarding that. You look at the poetry of the Hebrew Bible, that's political too. And so I suppose that was one of the things that it pointed to. Some of the poets whose work we were learning off by heart in Irish were executed by the British because of their desire or their involvement in revolutions for Irish independence. So sometimes that we would have been learning the poetry of a particular writer in Irish language class and then learning about the life and the politics of that particular poet in history class. And that, I think, was a very interesting approach to it. I don't want to idealize the Irish education system. Like, plenty of the learning off by heart was just, what did the poet mean in stanza 2? And please don't give us your personal opinion. So it wasn't a kind of a, oh my God, here's how I put myself into the middle of it. I happened to love it, but like my younger brother hates Sylvia Plath, but he can quote lengthy sections of Sylvia Plath to tell you why he does not like the poetry of Sylvia Plath. So that's one of the benefits of that system. So it doesn't make for a nation of poetry lovers necessarily. It does make for a nation of opinionated people about poetry.
In a lecture fairly recently, you described conflict as performative, and I had not quite thought of it that way. So unpack some of that for us. And how would you also see poetry as potentially something performative in the midst of such conflict?
First of all, I should say, by saying it's a performance, I don't mean to demean it and I don't mean to lighten it in any way. Within the context of that, I sometimes think of conflict as a stage, and we can get caught up with what's happening on the stage, between the characters on the stage. What I think can be helpful is to think of conflict as a theatre. And when you go to see a piece of theatre, of course, you're meant to be captivated by what's happening on stage. But what we also know is that in theatre, there's what's happening behind the stage. Who's the director? Who's written it? Who's making money? And in that way, sometimes when I see a conflict that's unfolding, it can be easy to be distracted by the drama about what's being sometimes performed and sometimes pretended there, when what really might need to be the serious question is who's making money from this? Who thinks that this is entertainment? Who is creating an environment where the spectacle on a pretty predictable plotline that's happening on stage might actually be hiding something much more malevolent behind? And that's what I mean by thinking about the wider theatrical elements that go into a conflict.
How did you begin to pay attention to that wiliness? And second, in what way, if any, does your formation in poetry and your work in poetry help inform your attentiveness to that kind of wiliness?
When did I begin to pay attention to it? I suppose the same as us all, in a certain sense, with age. I don't think I had a natural capacity to not be deceived. But yeah, I think it's just age and disappointment and probably seeing some of the same dynamics in myself. I don't want to stand outside that and say that I am outside of those kinds of models of deceit. One of the things that poetry is the practicing of noticing, the practicing of looking, and not necessarily by great poetic language, but sometimes by very simple language, by being able to see something really clearly and to name it. That art of noticing, that art of looking, I think can help us when there's the possibility of recognizing that sometimes what is beneath things actually is also being manifested on the surface. There can be an idea that we need to get beneath the surface sometimes to comprehend the dynamics about what are going on. But from time to time, things are right there in the surface, and it's not a matter of analysing it deeply. It's a matter of having the capacity to look at what is plainly present in front of you.
I love that phrase, the art of noticing. And obviously, we live in a culture that's so caught up in the economic possibilities of distracting us. What have you found to be helpful for yourself in regularly cultivating the art of noticing and not getting distracted from paying attention?
With any practice of paying attention, mine happens to be poetry, but for other people it might be 10 minutes of silence, or it might be a particular walk, or it can be all kinds of practices of prayer or meditation as well. I think anything that holds you steady just becomes a daily linchpin for returning to a place from which you can analyze what else is happening. And that kind of practice can make a big difference in our life. It doesn't have to be 3 hours a day. I think something small that is doable and fits in with your time can be a fantastic thing. Some people only have the few minutes while the coffee is brewing. If you can take that, that's great. I think any practice like that can be a huge help for setting aside the distraction about what's saying to you, be angry at this, be happy at this, be anxious about this, be worried about this, compare yourself to this. All of these things that compete for our attention that really tie into some very self-destructive patterns that can be part of us. And marketing really plays on that an enormous amount. Not just you need this, but you need to be seen to have this by other people. Those psychologies are deep in us and can be manipulated by whatever it is that's grabbing our attention. And for me, poetry is something about trying to move away from those complicated languages. Mary Oliver has a great line where, I think in a poem called Prayer, I'm sure I'm misquoting it, but she says, I know a lot of fancy words. I tear them from my tongue and then I pray. Good line, isn't it?
Indeed. In the first interview I got to do with you, we talked at some length about your work with the Corrymeela community and the peacemaking and reconciliation work you did there. I don't recollect us having talked about the way in which poetry may or may not have actually functioned in that work. What did that look like for you during that season of your life?
I was poet in residence for the Corrymeela community, which is Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community. I went on to lead Corrymeela then 10 years after that, but my first involvements with Corrymeela were all as poet in residence. And what that involved was being part of encounters between people who were coming together in the aftermath of conflict. And sometimes those were representatives of groups from cities that might have had problems with each other. Sometimes those were representatives of bereaved people who had lived through terrorism and paramilitarism and police brutality, and people who might have found it painful to be in a room with representatives of members of another community. Typically, people would meet once a week for a period of time, 6 months, 12 months. In the week in between the meetings, I would try to write a poem to speak back to what it was that people had witnessed amongst each other. They were never partisan poems, and they were not poems written for the purposes of kind of publishing in literary magazines. They were poems whose primary purpose and primary aim was to see if you could create a linguistic and emotional echo of what had happened in the week before, where some kind of recognizability, but also perhaps a certain sense of reframing, of being able to look at something. You know, reframing is a term used a lot in conflict resolution, but if you think about it literally, it can be very helpful. If you have a photograph or a piece of art that's been framed poorly, people might think, oh, I can barely see it. And then if it happens to be framed really well in a different way, people might go, wow, I can really see what's there now because somebody has done a beautiful job. And that's part of the art in conflict resolution of reframing, of being able to simply look at something. And that might involve grief, or it might involve information, or it might involve point of view. But in all of it, you are trying to reframe for the possibility of being able to contain it. You can't change the past in any intervention, but the hope is that you can look at the past in such a way that other things can happen. Maybe a bit of distance, maybe a bit of change, maybe a bit of wisdom, maybe a bit of accountability or confession, all of those kinds of things.
Any particular instances come to mind of that happening?
Yeah, I was just thinking that I'd open up a poem and read it for you and tell you some of the story of one of them.
Yeah.
So I was one time there as facilitator and artist in residence for an event that involved people from both sides of the border in Ireland, north and south. So people whose politics were either mostly Irish or mostly British, which is really the heart of the conflict there. Religion is the manifestation about how those distinctions are seen. But really the question isn't do you or do you not believe in a particular theology about Mary. The question really is do you think that the north of Ireland, that partitioned part, is or should be British or Irish? And then in the room also there was people, Israelis and Palestinians, of a whole variety of different points of view. And many people in the room had suffered terribly, awful grievances and awful pain. At one point, somebody in the room said that they had murdered someone, and somebody else in the room said, never use the word murder, because what you were doing was ordered by a higher up, so you were just following orders, and if lives were lost, lives were lost. And so a debate broke out in the room about language. And sometimes we can talk about language as if it's this esoteric thing, or that talking about words is just talking about words. But this was a group of people who were seriously reckoning with the accountability that comes with the language that you use. And then somebody else in the room said, well, I only ever shot at legitimate targets, so, that's how I explain my actions. And somebody else said, well, I suppose that made me a legitimate target when your organisation shot at me when I was 8 or 10. I can't remember what age they said. So anyway, here's a part of a poem called The Pedagogy of Conflict. When I was a child, I learned to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these days I've been counting lives, so I count one life. One life, one life, one life, one life. Because each time is the first time that life has been taken. Legitimate target has 16 letters and one long, abominable space between two dehumanizing words. So, that poem, as part of a reflection back to that group, the idea really was to say, this is what you said, and then to see what happens when people hear what it is that they've said.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and a conversation with poet and theologian Pádraig Ó Tuama. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in the episode and a full transcript. We also have a free bi-monthly newsletter in which I riff on themes and behind-the-scenes goings-on called the NSE Notebook. You can subscribe to that newsletter for free by going to our website at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. Coming up, Pádraig and I discuss the inevitable disappointments entailed in doing justice work, his experience with exorcisms and conversion therapy in the church, and his latest poetry collection, Kitchen Hymns. If you love No Small Endeavor, I suspect you will not want to miss joining us in Nashville for our Thanksgiving variety show on November 23. This year, we'll be joined by Sharon McMahon, #1 New York Times bestselling author and podcaster. Sharon is a longtime government and law educator who became known as America's government teacher during the 2020 election when she went viral for breaking down complex topics with a steadfast commitment to the facts. It'll be a night of thoughtful conversation, moving music, and a room full of folks all in pursuit of no small endeavor. This year it's at the beautiful Skirmerhorn Symphony Center here in Nashville. We'll be joined by the Choir Room, Grammy award-winning artist Allison Russell, and a full band for an amazing night you will not want to miss. Mark your calendars for November 23, and don't wait. Go get your tickets now at the link in the show notes or at nosmallendeavor.com/events.
Finished training for the day? Time to fight post-workout fatigue with Core Power Protein Shakes. They're packed with 26 grams of high-quality protein to build muscle and electrolytes to help hydrate. The nutrition you need to help your body replenish, rebuild, and repair post-workout so you can power on to the next one. Champion your recovery with Core Power. Visit corepower.com to learn more.
Introducing Meta Ray-Ban Display, the world's most advanced AI glasses. With a full color display built into the lens of the glasses, it's there when you need it and gone when you don't. Send and receive messages, translate or caption live conversations, collaborate with Meta AI, and more. Be one of the first to try Meta Ray-Ban Display. Visit meta.com/Meta Ray-Ban Display to book a demo and find your pair.
As you look back on that experience, what would you say are some of the most important formative experiences or intellectual constructs or dispositions that were formed in you through that experience?
So one of the things that comes to mind is that any group that sets itself up to address a particular complicated societal manifestation will have to face in themselves the very thing that they say they're set up to address. So a group that's set up to be a communication group will have to face their lack of communication internally. A group that's set up to name and to speak about peace and to promote peace will have to face their own internal lack of peace. And that is not a manifestation of hypocrisy, or it doesn't have to be. Really what it is, it's the first sign that you're engaging. And then the next thing is, and how are you engaging? And often what I see happening in peace groups is that when they begin to face their own serious internal difficulties, the question is really, how do we not be shocked, but how do we address it? And how do we turn to each other? And how do we not resort to the very tactics that we see outside the group to be manifested inside the group? And so if you're in the north of Ireland performing a certain neutral form of engagement without telling somebody on the other side what it is you really think, how is that going to manifest itself inside an organisation for peace, for instance? One of the things that I love about Corrymeela and Corrymeela's community is that people are quick to point out when it is that somebody's scapegoating somebody else. So if somebody's saying, well, we're doing this, and if it wasn't for that group, well, then things would be much easier. There's a really good culture of somebody just shouting out in the middle. That's just scapegoating. And that can be confronting, especially if you're in a position of leadership and you find yourself going, oh my God, yes, it is. But isn't that part of the purpose? For the inconvenience of not being able to get away with doing the very thing that you say you're set up to be against. And you will have to face it. The question is, do you have the mechanisms to cope when you face it?
So is it not hypocrisy because, I understand you to be saying, precisely because a given group of people have given themselves to try to do a particular work, that gives them the facility to be able to see the lack of the sufficient development, formation of that in themselves? Is that what you're getting at?
maybe by saying it's not hypocrisy mightn't be a helpful framing of it. But I suppose I do want to say that, like, anybody can feel discouraged when you join a group that's got a good purpose. And then 6 months in, a year in, 6 years in, I just began to realize that they had these big problems on the inside. But that is ahead of you, no matter what group you join. Disappointment is ahead of all of us. And for me, when we can attune ourselves to the fact that every human-led organization is going to stumble, and also that every organization that's probably overworked and underfunded, that is set up particularly to address a problem, is going to face problems of their own, you can prepare yourself a little bit for the disappointment so that you're not shocked when it comes about. And perhaps you can even cultivate something internally that, rather than thinking those people out there are the ones who are always doing the problem, and if they might be a serious problem, but internally the mechanisms for knowing how it is your own organization work, that dynamics of power are going to show up there too. And possibly dynamics of power that are closely linked to the dynamics of power that you're being critical of out there. And it isn't to say that you don't have a mission. You probably do. But the question for me is, how will you face the fact that you're going to struggle with each other as well as struggle with people outside? And that, I think, is something that I learned deeply, mostly through failure, and mostly through frustration. So I suppose I'm saying this in terms of the years working within these peace organizations of looking at those things. Sometimes I would think it's easier to work with paramilitary groups than it is to lead the committee at Corrymeela, because at least the threats in a paramilitary group are explicit, whereas sometimes the threats in a peace organization are much more subtle and complex and pervasive and poisonous. If somebody said, issues a direct threat, well, then you can address the direct threat. If somebody looks in your face and pretends to be sweetness and light, but actually is being vicious and undermining behind you and then denying that, that's much more difficult to know how to speak to.
You've pointed several times already in our conversation to the power of words, the need for accountability for our words. And I kind of like to shift a moment and think a little bit about theology and conflict and poetry, all centering around the power of words. And first, ask how you see theological commitments, theological engagement, theological constructs shaping the way you write, how you read poetry, or where you are and just simply you're seeking to live life these days.
Well, I was born in 1975, so I grew up in a particular kind of era of Irish Catholicism, maybe the last era of Irish Catholicism. Things have changed a lot. But like, if you cut me, I bleed Catholic. And that's got very little to do with questions about personal belief and devotion. It's just entirely cultural, in the sense of, I just went to an ordinary village school, but it was a Catholic maintained school. So the priest and the life of the church was involved. I happened to come from a very devout family, so that was enormous. And for a long time, I tried to be very devout too. And some of that was devotion and some of that was fear. And so my engagement with a literature of life and a mythology, and I mean that positively, as in an arranging principle of story, was primarily religious and primarily Catholic and primarily Irish Catholic, all of those internal distinctions. So that has absolutely manifested a way that I think about the world, a certain way that I think about literature in some edges too. But of course, much of the poetry that we were learning in school and that I read has got very, very little interest to do with religion. But theology and religious ways of thinking and the power of a religious idea to have political consequences or local consequences or national ones, and some of those fruitfully and some of those to levels of terror, I've seen that as many, many people around the world have. And that's got nothing to do with whether they're personally religious. It's got everything to do with growing up in an environment where the language of religion has often overlapped with the language of power and the language of country.
In your introduction, I think it was, to the 7 Deadly Sonnets, you at one point said, and you're speaking, as I recollect here, with the context of your own childhood experiences with the faith of your youth, the way to break a man is to make him hate himself.
Indeed.
Could you unpack some of that for us?
Seven Deadly Sonnets was a sequence of poems I wrote about having gone through exorcisms and reparative therapies for getting rid of the gay in me. And it was 15 years after all of that I began writing them. And though I wasn't writing them in the midst of the pain or the shock of all of that, I was much more interested in being able to look at them from a point of view of distance. And in some ways, the man who went through that felt like a different country, which was beneficial. And writing the poems helped me make some distance between myself and myself in a very, very helpful way. And so that poem, it's the third of the Seven Deadly Sonnets. The words you quoted are the opening lines. The way to break a man is to make him hate himself. So I found myself at doorways, one at the top of steps where my exorcisers waited, getting absolution from a priest who thrust his crotch into my face, shaking outside a bar I was too chaste to enter. The context of this was that the third exorcism I was put through was, the first one was pretty ridiculous and dramatic and loud and shocking amongst a lot of people in a charismatic prayer group. The second one was just with men. I think they might have decided that seeing as the first one was unsuccessful to get rid of all the gay devils in me, that I needed a second one with just men. And then when I said to somebody later on that my temptations, as I was kind of being schooled to call them, were not gone, I was just 18. My God, I was a child and confused and frightened. Anyway, that person then said, well, look, here's the last thing to try, which is that you do an exorcism on yourself. So he said, go into that room there. And he said, close the door. I think he might have even said, lock the door. And don't come out until you've done an exorcism on yourself. And many years later, it struck me that that is a certain form of divide and conquer, to divide and conquer a person, to make you hate yourself. That is a tactic that colonizers used the world over, and that anybody who wants to break apart a group uses. It's a horrifically successful and manipulative tactic and technology that has been around for a very long time for diabolical purposes. And that's what I wanted to look at in those poems in many ways, was the dynamics of that kind of diabolical activity.
American Bible Belt Christianity had its own form of Protestant sexual repression, fear, anxiety that I had to take years to work through myself. And I'm fascinated by, you at one point said something like, when you're told you have the devil in you and you realize you don't, you start asking larger questions. And I've thought at various times in my life of, why did I go on and do so many years of theological study? I think it's partly what you just said right there. It's like there's a sort of drivenness to ask bigger, different, more compelling questions out of that experience of the ways in which the power of language can be so damaging and causing you to hate yourself. Any other commentary on that or thoughts arise out of that confluence of things?
So I was about 12 or 13 the first time I heard that gay people had devils in us, which is very frightening to hear, of course. I have such admiration for people that I know who heard similar things and then maybe within a few years just thought, to hell with it, forget it, and just left religion behind. I was never able to do that. I kind of needed to face the beast. And that really has shaped my life and shaped my language, shaped my art, and shaped my intellectual activities too. I too spent many years doing various studies in religion. It felt necessary for me. It always felt like I had to stay and to try to figure it out. My ideas about religion have changed enormously, but we all have a certain form of narrative that holds us together. And sometimes that narrative is one that we wrestle with and that has been unkind or cruel to us. And for many people, that might be religion, but it could also be your own constitution, or it could be your national constitution, or it could be the Epic of Gilgamesh, or it could be Harry Potter. I suppose I'm interested in, can the wrestle with that narrative be good enough? Because that narrative will never be good enough. There's always going to be the need to find a way to engage with it. And as decades go by, to deepen the wrestle with it and to find more and more ways of being free within the context of that. And that, I think, is the life challenge that's presented by being part of any narrative, not to look for the perfect one, but to look for a way to, with more and more integrity, manifest your own curiosity in the midst of whatever narrative you're part of.
Coming up is a short break, followed by more Pádraig's poetry, a discussion of theology as it relates to his work, and his observations as an Irishman in New York.
It's easy to know you want to make a change in your life, but it is hard to actually do it. How to Be a Better Human from TED is a podcast for when self-help feels too daunting or just not for you. I'm Chris Duffy, the host of How to Be a Better Human, and trust me, I do not have it all figured out. But join me as I talk to experts about actually attainable ways we can try to improve our lives. Whether it's facing fears, setting boundaries, cleaning your house, or all sorts of other topics. Find How to Be a Better Human wherever you get your podcasts.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the Dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Sean Bean and Connie Nielsen star in Robin Hood. From Sherwood Forest to the Norman Court, a classic tale reborn for today. The story continues to unfold. New episodes Sundays on MGM+.
We've talked about the way in which the sort of work of reconciliation and the work of poetry have been crucial to your public persona, public self. But how would you describe the way in which reframing made possible by poetry or glimpsing new metaphors or the art of attention, how has all of that worked within you personally?
You know, for a long time, the struggle was looking at myself as a gay man and trying to face that in the context of the Ireland and the Catholicism that I grew up in and the very, very heavily American evangelicalism that influenced the ecumenism that I was part of as well in Ireland. And, you know, trying to find my way through and out of all of those was a necessary artistic and personal project for a long time. As I said, you know, those can feel a very long time ago. But I still am trying to think about religion, of course. Not because it's a burden on me anymore, but because of the opposite, really. I'm interested in the question of belief. There used to be some Protestant missionaries from Belfast would come down to Cork, and maybe because they thought that all Catholics were going to hell, they would set up these little evangelistic projects in our village. And I got to know them all. And, you know, they would sometimes stop the priest who was on his way in to say Mass and say, "Do you believe in God?" And they think they were being enormously radical by asking that confrontational question, instead of just being utterly patronizing and arrogant, you know. These were young people too who were being shaped and formed by somebody who told them what to think and believe, you know. So it wasn't like they were just kind of waking up one morning and thinking, I'm going to be sectarian. We were all products of a system. So the question for me of do you believe in God has had a long history, and I was interested in trying to push into some of the spaciousness that could be in that question, so that rather than it being a yes or no question, that there could be an idea of, well, what does that question open? What door does it open? What's it like if the quality of the you is there with curiosity rather than demand or threat? That's what I was really working on with the most recent book, Kitchen Hymns. I'll read one of the Do You Believe in God poems. There's 16 poems in this, all with the same title, Do You Believe in God? But here's one of them. Do you believe in God? I don't believe in God, I said. And she said, oh, somehow I thought you'd managed to keep that going, even though I haven't. She asked if I'd told others. Yes, I said, I have. I mean, it's not like I'm saying I know about what is. It's just that the burden of belief isn't on me anymore. God, it feels much freer. I believe I'm in the room next to belief. I hear the sounds of prayers coming through the walls. I like the smell of incense and the sound of fabric, rustling fabric as the people stand or kneel. Sometimes I can tell the text by the intonation of the reader. I mutter the responses underneath my breath. Lift up your hearts. And do you, she asked, lift up your heart? Yes, I said, I do. But I don't know to who. Whom, she said. Let's get started on the soup.
People who listen to our show and former students of mine would have heard me say ad nauseum, one of my favorite lines from the early church is Irenaeus, who said, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. And there's a sort of fully aliveness in that disbelief that you're describing there, right? That it's a sort of lightness that has this beautiful way of being in the world.
Yeah. I mean, the speaker of this poem clearly has a deep religious interest, being in the room next to a belief and listening in, and hasn't gone too far. For me, one of the arts of poetry is, you've got the topic that you're trying to write about, but then you're trying to do other things alongside it, and making sure you're trying to do 2 or 3 things at the same time means that your poem isn't just about being angry, or your poem isn't just about this thing, that somehow there's something else happening. And so in this poem especially, I was really interested in elongated vowel sounds, assonance. So just listen to vowel sounds in this. Forget what I'm saying, but listen to the vowel sounds in the opening stanza. I don't believe in God, I said. And she said, oh, somehow I thought you'd managed to keep that going, even though I haven't. So that's just most of the first stanza. So don't, oh, going, though. And so finding a way where there's a music in that particular piece that is doing, and that continues throughout the poem. Irish language poetry is filled with what Yeats called the Irish mode, which is elongated vowel sounds that create a certain syncopation of rhythm that isn't quite as formal as end-line rhyme, but that nonetheless creates an echo of something within itself. And there's always a kind of comfort and a kind of music in that. And it changes subtly, and then you realize, oh, suddenly we're listening to a different vowel sound rather than that. And that's part of the way of indicating that the poem has turned an auditory corner. But then this is in a book called Kitchen Hymns, and I suppose I wanted to locate the conversation about religion in a domestic setting. So the other speaker in it, my friend, this did happen, where I say, yes, I said I do, but I don't know to who. And then she said, whom? Which was delicious to talk about language in the context of this. And ultimately, this is the unfolding of language. But then even more than that, it's the unfolding of sustenance and nurture and the kind of hospitality that a good friendship is. Let's get started on the soup. And that was the real interest to me.
You're spending most of your time in the States these days. And I wonder...
In the land of the free and the home of the brave.
That's right. I wonder what's especially standing out to you about the current American political moment and the particularities of our hostilities or the particularities of our refusal to give an accountability for our use of language and so forth?
Well, it's a hard question to answer, Lee, because I'm a foreigner, and even though I'm living in this country now, it's too easy and arrogant to think that somebody from outside understands. I'm not neutral, of course. I know pretty much the way I'd vote were I to live here. But there has been an escalation, I think, especially in a two-party political system like you have here, and other places do not have that necessarily, and that's a benefit. There has been an escalation that who you vote for is who you are, and that will fail you because politics is about winning every 4 years or 5 years or 3 years, depending as to what the cycle is in your particular democracy. And so that is giving an enormous amount about who you are away to somebody whose job it is to exploit that for the purposes of winning a political election. And I don't mean exploit in a negative sense. They just need you to vote for them. And that will fail if you think that that is the fullness of who you are. I do think at the moment there is an easy way to exploit outrage. And I'm not saying that the outrage is that I'm not outraged myself, but it isn't enough, because the exploitation to outrage is part of what is sometimes keeping people apart and fostering an idea of them over there. And that will fail. That will fail all of us. Beyond the question as to who's in power, there is the question as to who are we. And there are many other powerful, authoritative voices in the American intellectual project, writing over the last couple of 100 years, and then writing like Joy Harjo does from an American tradition that is thousands of years old, that remind us of something else. And that is necessary, especially in an era when you are being easily manipulated and pulled apart.
So with regard to Yeats, you mentioned a moment ago, you have commented that you have a preference for his later work. I think the phrase was because it carries the wisdom of failure.
Yeah, it does.
And my first question about that is, describe that for us just a bit. of how you see that operating in him.
Well, I mean, Yeats was writing sophisticated and brilliant poetry from an early age. He was from an Anglo-Irish family. He didn't speak Irish fluently, but he spoke it enough that he'd learned from the servants in the house. He was Irish enough for the British and British enough for the Irish in that way. He really was part of that kind of set of Anglo-Irishism. His early poetry, some of it is deeply moving, and lots of it is extrapolating on mythologies that people would have told in Irish, and he's writing them through a lens of a certain form of kind of poetic English language formalism. They're studied and they're weighty and they're sometimes trying to prove their own importance. And as years went by, his poetry became far less burdened by him trying to do that. He wasn't trying to prove too much anymore. Instead, he was trying to make his language simpler. And it's an invitation. Once you have maybe learned some of the training wheels of poetry or any form of art, and perhaps you feel the need, and people probably demand it to you, to prove your place within the art form, that if 50 years later you're still proving your place in the art form, well, then you've missed out an enormous amount of something else. And ultimately, none of us will feel like we totally belong. It's easy at the age of 20 to say, I need to prove I belong to this. But hopefully at the age of 50, you think, I don't belong to anything. I'm here just trying to write. And I'm here just trying to see and make afresh with the emptiness of the exhalation and the potential of the inhalation, that which I can do. Of course, you're holding all your learning, but you're hopefully holding it lightly. And that as a psychology of aging and a psychology of art and aesthetics interests me enormously.
So what would be some examples for you in which that wisdom of failure or that wisdom of aging has taken specific form in your life or your work?
I suppose I look to how it is that noticing is an explicit part of my art now, that I'm really interested in writing about birds or writing about the light in the air or writing about the richness of the night air or that which is also there. That has changed me over the last 5 years of being more attuned to that. I grew up in the countryside, so it's not like I was away from that. But the connection to it has something to do with time. I'm 50 later on this year. It has something to do with locale, something to do with a concern for the environment. But it also has a displacement because that interest is seeing myself as a growing thing among growing things and a dying thing among dying things. Hopefully I'll make good compost, and to think about what it means to make good compost in terms of your life, in terms of what you do. I mean, there's a whole variety of poems that are particularly attuned to that. The last poem in Kitchen Hymns is a poem called Untitled/Misse. Misse is the word in Latin from which we get the word in English mission, also the word mass for, a religious service. It means to go. I should say the last word in this poem is a sound. It sounds like a word, but it's a sound. You'll know what I mean when I get to it. Untitled Misse. I bless myself in the name of the deer and ox, the heron and the hare, evangelists of land and wood and air, the fox as well, that red predator of chickens, prey of cars, and the salmon and the trout sleeping in the reeds. When the wren wakes, I'll ask her blessing, and if she comes out, she'll bring it. The squirrel buries where she thinks no one else can see. I bless myself in her secrecy. There's a field mouse I've seen scampering at dusk, picking up the seeds dropped by the finches and the tits throughout the day. Some nest of frenzy waits her kindness and her pluck. I go in the name of all of them, their chaos and their industry, their replacements, their population, their forgettable ways, their untamed natures, their ignorance of why or how or who. I did have an owl mentioned in that poem, but then I thought I'd rather hear the owl rather than mention it. So that's the last. Nietzsche had a question about the why, the how, the who. And so there's a little reference to Nietzsche in that, but for me it is elevated by being interrupted by the sound of an owl at night.
Been talking to Pádraig Ó Tuama, poet, theologian, peacemaker. Pádraig, it's been lovely talking with you today, and grateful so much for your beautiful work in the world and your beautiful spirit. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lee.
Here's a closing take on our interview with Pádraig Ó Tuama, part 3 of our series addressing Chris Wiman's question, what is poetry's role when the world is burning? 3 particularly helpful practices toward a good life I wanted to note at the end of this interview with Pádraig, which I found lovely. First, ask some wily questions. Ask, in what way is a given conflict being performed? Our interview with Nancy French recently made this explicit. There's a great deal of performance of political conflict going on around us, so keep asking questions like these. Who's making money from this? Who thinks that this is entertainment? Who is creating an environment where the spectacle is distracting us from something perhaps much more malevolent? Second, this came through so clearly with Pádraig, accountability for and with our language, our words, that we must come again to terms with the power of words, that words make possible and foreclose possibility. They illuminate and obscure, they summon and silence, they create and destroy. Our recklessness with our words will not serve us well. A new measure of accountability with our words might help reknit the bonds our words have torn. And last, the art of noticing. Here we return to one of my favorite topics and its attendant practices, like practices of looking, the art of noticing. There's all sorts of ways to do this, as Pádraig noted, poetry for him especially, but also silence, walking, prayer, meditation. I'm a fan of all of those. Plus journaling, plus sitting on my front porch in the morning as the sun comes up with a cup of coffee, and also walking slowly, especially on late summer days, just past sunset, noticing, wondering at the brilliance and pulsating energy in the massive tumbling cumulonimbus clouds, a burning, brilliant coral emblazoned by the days like last night on my walk with our dog Otis. In some such moments, I find myself again caught up in the irrefutable beauty of life, the generosity of the globe, the abundance and awe right here, everywhere, if only we will pause to look and pay attention. And I'm reminded that such paying attention, such art of noticing, might just save my soul and help me make a contribution to the peace of the planet. That's a small, but not so small closing take on today's episode. Peace to you, my friend. You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Pádraig Ó Tuama. His latest poetry collection, Kitchen Hymns, is available at all of your favorite booksellers. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.